Hello. This episode is interesting and risky. I now realize that this video might not get to be seen by everyone because of these guys or these guys. So I ask after you watch the video to share it to your friends. Trust me, you want to watch it till the end. Now, let's start. Let me tell you a story about the roots of the American Revolution. It all started when the American colonies decided they could no longer endure England's aggressive rule and sought their independence. While many of factors fueled the revolution, it stands out as the most significant. King George III of England outlawed the colonies' interest-free independent currency. This forced the colonies to borrow money from the Central Bank of England, plunging them into economic uncertainty and despair. Peter Cooper, a former vice president of the New York Board of Currency, shared how Benjamin Franklin had once explained to the British government that this interest-free currency was the true source of the colonies' prosperity. But the British, threatened by this revelation, swiftly passed laws forbidding the payment of taxes with that currency. The resulting hardship was unbearable, and soon whispers of rebellion began to spread. Little did they know, something far more ominous was on the horizon. By 1783, America had won its independence from England, but its battle against the concept of the central bank and the corrupt power-hungry mentality it represented was just beginning. But what exactly is a central bank? A central bank is essentially an institution that controls and regulates a nation's entire currency, holding immense power over interest rates and the money supply. The central bank doesn't merely issue money to the government. It loans it to them with interest. By manipulating the money supply, the central bank essentially dictates the value of the currency. Over time, this system inevitably leads to one outcome: debt. Why? Because every dollar produced by the central bank and the commercial banks is loaned out at interest, meaning each dollar is really a dollar plus a percentage of debt. Given that the banking system has a monopoly on currency production, and each dollar comes with immediate debt, another question emerges: where does the money to pay off the debt comes from? The only source is the banks. That would require a constant increase in the money supply to temporarily cover the mounting debt. But this new money is also loaned out with interest, creating even more debt. The result is a form of economic slavery, where escaping the cycle of self-generating debt becomes impossible. They tried to take over the United States many times and failed because Thomas Jefferson and the Patriots vowed to stop the evil tyrants at all costs. He said,
"To preserve our independence, we must not let our rulers load us with perpetual debt. We must make our choice between economy and liberty or profusion and servitude."
However, the bankers' agents, such as Alexander Hamilton, the first Secretary of Treasury of the United States, urged to have a central bank. Even after Jefferson's warnings and discretion, the central bank was created. However, the attempt of central bank order lasted only 20 years and it was shut down. But the bankers tried to open it again in Andrew Jackson's presidency. After surviving an assassination attempt, Jackson finally defeated the bankers. In 1836, when asked what was the greatest accomplishment in his life, Andrew Jackson replied, and those were his last words:
"I killed the bank."
After that, with real money backed with real gold, the United States experienced the greatest economic boom in any nation's history. But the bankers, greedy for more power, wealth, were concluding their most ambitious plan yet, to once and for all take control of the finances of the United States. By the early 20th century, the US has already seen several central banking systems come and go, each maneuvered into place by ruthless bankers' interests. The dominant family of the banking system are the Rockefellers, Morgans, Warburgs, and Rothschilds. They were determined to push legislations for yet another central bank, but they knew the public and the government were deeply suspicious of such an institution. So they needed to orchestrate an incident, one that would shift public opinion in their favor. And JP Morgan had just the idea. J.B. Morgan, widely regarded as a financial genius at the time and one of the key figures behind the Titanic sinking, wielded his influence to reportedly spread rumors that major banks in New York were insolvent or bankrupt. Morgan knew this would spark a panic and systemic crisis, and it did. In fear of losing their deposits, the public rushed to withdraw their money, leading banks to call in their loans. This forced borrowers to sell their properties, triggering a cascade of bankruptcies, repossessions, and widespread chaos. Congressman Charles Lindbergh pieced together the puzzle, writing, "The King bankers set in motion a grand scheme in 1907. They had speculated on Wall Street until countless water stocks and bonds had been created. The King bankers knew the situation and warned their closest ally what was to come. The panic was to be engineered in the fall of 1907, and it would be blamed on the overflow banking concurrency laws." The panic of 1907 led to a congressional investigation headed by Senator Nelson Aldrich, a man deeply connected to the financial elite and who later became part of the Rockefeller family through marriage. The Aldrich Commission recommended the establishment of a central bank to prevent another panic like 1907. This was exactly the opening the bankers needed. In 1910, a secret meeting took place at J.P. Morgan Estate in Jekyll Island off the coast of Georgia, where the central banking bill was drafted not by lawmakers but by bankers, and they decided that none of them should run the central bank. They figured that they have lost it before because of openness. So their idea was to call it the Federal Reserve, to fool the public that they have control over it. This meeting was so secretive, so hidden from both government and public eye, that all 10 of the attendees disguised their identities while traveling to the island. Once the bill was written, it was handed to their political frontman, Senator Nelson Aldrich, to push through for Congress. In 1913, with a strong backing from bankers, Woodrow Wilson became president, having already agreed to sign the Federal Reserve Act in exchange for campaign support. Just days before Christmas, while much of Congress was home with their families, the Federal Reserve Act was quietly passed, and Wilson made it law. The night before its passage, Congressman Charles Lindbergh issued a chilling warning. This act establishes the most gigantic trust on earth. When the president signed this act, the invisible government by the money power will be legalized. But little did he know, his prophecy come to pass. The public was led to believe that the Federal Reserve System would stabilize the economy, making inflation and financial crises a thing of the past. But history has shown that nothing could be further from the truth. In reality, the bankers had created a powerful machine for economic manipulation. Take, for instance, the period from 1914 to 1919, when the Fed significantly increased the money supply, leading to extensive loans for small banks and the public. Then in 1920, the Fed suddenly contracted credits, forcing banks to call in large numbers of loans. Just like in 1907, this triggered bank runs, bankruptcies, and a systematic collapse. Numerous competitive banks outside the Federal Reserve System failed, further consolidating the monopoly of the money trust cartel. Aware of this scheme, Congressman Lindbergh declared, "Under the Federal Reserve Act, panics are scientifically created. The present panic is the first scientifically created one, worked out like a mathematical equation." But the panic of 1920 was just the beginning. From 1921 to 1929, the Fed once again increased the money supply, resulting again in extensive loans to the public and banks. A new type of loan, the broker call loan, became popular in the stock market. This loan allowed investors to put down only a fraction of the stock, the rest being loaned out by the broker. During the roaring 20s, as everyone seemed to be making monies in the market, this method was highly favored. But there was a catch. The loan could be called at any time and had to be repaid within 24 hours, often leading to the forced sale of the stock purchased with that loan. A few months before October 1929, insiders like J.D. Rockefeller and Bernard Baruch quietly exited the market, aware that the bubble was about to be burst. Then on October 24, 1929, the financiers who provided the call loans began calling them en masse. This triggered an instantaneous massive sell-off in the already inflated market, with sell orders and margin calls flooding in. The resulting panic led to mass bank runs, the collapse of thousand banks, and the opportunity for land banks to buy up the failed institutions at a discount. But the damage didn't stop there, and instead of expanding the money supply to aid recovery, the Fed actually contracted it further, fueling one of the greatest depressions in American history. Outraged, Congressman Lord McFadden, then chairman of the House Banking Committee, filed a petition for the impeachment of the Federal Reserve Board, stating, "Mr. Chairman, we have in this country one of the most corrupt institutions the world has ever known. I refer to the Federal Reserve Board and the Federal Reserve Banks. This evil institution has impoverished and ruined the people of the United States and has practically bankrupted our government. It has done this through the defects of the law under which it operates, through the maladministration of that law by the Federal Reserve Board, and through the corrupt practices of the moneyed vulture who control it." As passionate as McFadden was, he didn't realize just how deep the conspiracy run. The Federal Reserve, having reduced society to squalor, pushed for the gold standard to be removed as well. To do this, they needed to acquire the remaining gold in the systems. Under the threat of imprisonment for 10 years, everyone in America was required to turn all gold bullion to the treasury, essentially robbing the public of what wealth they had. At the end of 1933, the gold standard was abolished. If you look at the dollar bill before 1933, it says it's redeemable in gold. If you look at the dollar bill today, it is a legal tender, which means it is backed by absolutely nothing. The only thing that gives our money value is public faith and how much of it is in circulation. The power to regulate the money supply is in essence the power to regulate its value. An immense power that can be used to manipulate and control entire economies. It's crucial to understand this. The Federal Reserve is a private corporation. It is as federal as Federal Express. The Fed sets its own policies and operates with minimal oversight from the US government because no one is allowed inside the Federal Reserve. No American citizen, no elected member of Congress, not the Supreme Court, not the Justice Department, not the CIA, FBI, not anyone. It is a private bank that loans all currency to the government at interest, perfectly aligned with the central banking model that the country sought to escape when it declared independence during the American Revolution. The Fed printing money is unconstitutional. The US Treasury is supposed to create all money, but now the Fed controls the printing of America's money. Nobody gets a dollar that the Fed didn't print. But the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 wasn't the only bill quietly pushed through Congress by those with vested financial interest. They also ensured the passage of its evil twin, the federal income tax. Let's start by saying this. The federal income tax is completely unconstitutional. It is a direct and apportioned tax, and the required number of states needed to ratify the amendment to allow the income tax was never legally met. This has even been cited in modern cases. Second, at the present day, roughly 25% of the average worker's income is taken from them via this tax. That means you work 3 months after the year to fulfill this tax obligation. But where would that money go? According to the Grace Commission report of the 1980s, 100% of what is collected is absorbed solely by interest on the federal debt and by the federal government contributions to transfer payment. In other words, all individual income tax revenues are gone before one nickel is spent on the services which taxpayers expect from their government. Today, the money Americans make working 3 months out of the year goes almost entirely for the interest rate charged for the debt-based fiat currency. The fact is, the federal income tax exists to feed the interest-hungry Federal Reserve and the federal government money machine, ensuring that the interest payments are always there. And third, even with the government's claim regarding the legality of the income tax, there is still evidently no statute, no law in existence that requires you to pay this tax.
I really expected that, of course, there's a law that you can point to in the law book, the code, that requires you to file a tax return. Of course there is. I was at that point where I couldn't find the statute that clearly made a person liable. At least not me and most people I know. And I had no choice in my mind except to resign.
Based on the research that I did throughout the year 2000 and that I'm still doing, I have not found that law. I've asked Congress, we've asked a lot of people in the IRS commissioners, helpers. They can't answer, because if they answer, the American people are going to know that this whole thing is a fraud.
I haven't filed an federal income tax return since I left.
I have not filed a tax return since 1999.
Now, the control of the economy and the manipulation of society for the vested financial powers is only part of the game being played. Another level is the business of war. The bankers were supporting both sides of the war between England and Napoleon in the 1800s. After the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, the bankers, receiving secret news of the English ultimate victory, pretended that England was doomed, started selling their English stocks. The English went to a selling frenzy to get rid of worthless English money. But it was a trick by the bankers. They waited until the stock plummeted to pennies, and they bought it for nothing. When the English leaders found out they had no choice but to give themselves over to the bankers, the money was gone, and they were slaves to the bankers' war debt. Since that time, the English have been paying the national taxes directly to the private bankers, and the people have no idea. This guy actually said this.
It's the best business I've ever done. If I can control a nation's wealth, I care not who makes its laws.
Since the inception of the Federal Reserve in 1913, a number of large and small wars have commenced. The three most pronounced wars are World War I, II, and Vietnam. In 1914, World War broke out in Europe, centered around England and Germany. The American public wanted nothing to do with the war, and in turn, President Woodrow Wilson publicly declared neutrality. However, under the surface, evidence now shows that the financial powers behind the administration were looking for any excuses they could find to enter the war. It is important to understand that one of the most lucrative things that can happen for bankers is war, for it forces the country to borrow even more money at interest, not to mention the profits generated through the financing of the military production. In the words of two-time Congressional Medal of Honor winner Smedley D. Butler, war is a racket, it always has been, and it's possibly the oldest, easily the most profitable, surely the most vicious. It is the only one international in scope, and it's the only one in which the profits are reckoned in dollars and the losses in lives. Woodrow Wilson's top advisor and mentor was Colonel Edward House, a man found to have intimate connections with the financial cartel of the time. In a conversation with Colonel House, Wilson's advisor, and Sir Edward Grey, the Foreign Secretary of England, regarding America and the war, Grey inquired, what will America do if Germans sink an ocean liner with American passengers on board? House responded, I believe that a flame of indignation would sweep the United States, and that by itself would be sufficient to carry us into war. But what House didn't reveal was how far this plan had already been set in motion. On May 7, 1915, a ship called Lusitania was sent to an area where German military vessels were known to be, and as likely expected, German U-boats torpedoed the ship, exploding stored munitions and killing 1,200 people. To further understand the obvious anticipation of this setup, the German embassy put advertisement in the New York Times, warning people that if they boarded the Lusitania, they did so at their own risk. As such, a ship sailing from America to England through the war zone would be liable to destruction. In turn, and as anticipated, the sinking of Lusitania caused a wave of anger among the American population, and America entered the war. A short time after, December 7, 1941, Japan attacked the American fleet at Pearl Harbor, triggering US entry into the World War II. President Franklin Roosevelt declared the attack a day that will live in infamy. A day of infamy indeed, but not because of the alleged surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. After 60 years of surfacing information, it is now clear that not only was the attack known well in advance, it was outright wanted and provoked. In a journal entry by Roosevelt's Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, dated November 25, 1941, he documented a conversation he had with Roosevelt. The question was, how we should maneuver them into firing the first shot. In a congressional testimony later, he added that it was desirable to make sure the Japanese be the ones to do this, so that there should remain no doubt as to who the aggressor were. In the months leading up to the attack on Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt had done almost everything in his power to anger the Japanese, showing a posture of aggression. He halted all of Japan imports of American petroleum, froze all Japanese assets in the United States, made public loans to nationalist China, and supplied military aid to the British, both enemies of Japan. All of this, by the way, was in complete violation of international war rules, and with numerous Japanese codes broken in advance, revealing the plan to attack December 7, 1941, Japan was allowed to attack Pearl Harbor, killing 2,400 soldiers. Before Pearl Harbor, 80% of the American public wanted nothing to do with the war. After Pearl Harbor, 1 million men volunteered. It is important to note that Nazi Germany war effort was largely supported by two organizations, one of which was called IG Farben. IG Farben produced 84% of Germany's explosives. One of the unspoken partners of IG Farben was J.D. Rockefeller Standard Oil Company in the United States. In fact, the German Air Force could not operate without a special additive patented by Rockefeller Standard Oil. The bombing of London by Nazi Germany, for example, was made possible by $20 million sale of fuel to IG Farben, a Rockefeller Standard Oil Company. This is just one small point on the topic of how an American business funded both sides of World War II. One other treasonous organization worth mentioning is the Union Banking Corporation of New York City. Not only did they finance numerous aspects of Hitler's rise to power, along with actual materials during the war, it was also a Nazi money laundering bank, which was eventually exposed by having millions of dollars of Nazi money in its vaults. The Union Banking Corporation of New York was eventually seized for violation of the Trading with the Enemy Act. Guess who the director and vice president of the Union Bank was? Prescott Bush, the father and grandfather of former US President George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush.
For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence.
It's not a surprise that the financial boogeyman has a grip on most politicians in power, either through campaign supports or outright extortion. The last president to stand up to the Fed was JFK. On June 4, 1963, President Kennedy signed Executive Order number 11110. This executive order empowered the US Treasury to issue real money without the Fed. It would have worked. Kennedy's plan to dismantle the Federal Reserve machine had begun. 6 months later, John F. Kennedy went to Dallas and never returned. The new President Lyndon Johnson threw out Kennedy's order. Since JFK, no president has dared conform the secret powers behind the Federal Reserve. They consolidate bigger and bigger. Banks print more and more money, accountable to no one, decimating the United States' wealth for the benefit of the few. Now moving to East Asia, the United States' official escalation and entry into the Vietnam War came after an alleged incident involving 2 US destroyers being attacked by North Vietnamese BT boats in the Gulf of Tonkin. This is known as the Gulf of Tonkin incident. This situation was the catalyst pretext for a massive troop deployment and full-fledged warfare. One problem, however, the attack on the US destroyers by Vietnamese BT boats never happened. Former Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara stated years later that the Gulf of Tonkin incident was a mistake, while classified documents released years later showed that it was a farce manipulated for the purposes of war. Once in the war, it was business as usual. In October 1966, President Lyndon Johnson lifted trade restricted on the Soviet bloc, knowing full well that the Soviets were providing upwards of 80% of North Vietnamese war supplies. Consequentially, the Rockefeller interest financed factory in the Soviet Union, which the Soviets used to manufacture military equipment and sent to North Vietnam. However, the funding of both sides in this conflict was only one side of the coin. In 1985, Vietnam's rules of engagement were declassified. These details what American troops were and were not allowed to do in the war. It included such absurdities as North Vietnamese anti-aircraft missile system not being allowed to be bombed until they were known to be operational. No enemy could be pursued once they crossed the border of Laos or Cambodia, and most revealing all, the most critical strategic targets were not allowed to be attacked unless initiated by high military officials. Apart from these illogical limitations, North Vietnam was informed of these restrictions and therefore could base entire strategies around the limitations of the American forces. This is why the war went on for so long. The bottom line is, the Vietnam War was never meant to be won, just sustained. This war for profit and resources resulted in 58,000 American deaths and 3 million dead Vietnamese. Now let's fast forward to 2001. September 11th was a disaster to many Americans. It is perhaps the most horrific attack on an American soil since Pearl Harbor. Whether it was an inside job or a vicious act of terrorism, it was a war pretext, no different from the sinking of Louisiana, the provoking of Pearl Harbor, and the Gulf of Tonkin lie. In fact, if 9/11 wasn't planned war pretext, it would be an exception to the rule. It has been used to launch two unprovoked illegal wars, one against Iraq and their never found WMD, and the other against Taliban and Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. But what many fail to realize, 9/11 was a pretext for another war, the war against you. The attack on New York changed many things about Americans, and it ushered in a type of authority to those in power. The Patriot Act, Homeland Security, the Military Commissions Act, and other legislations are all completely designed to destroy your civil liberties and protect those in power. The public at large now believes the invasions of Iraq and the Middle East, along with the resulting instability, are the consequences of political and military mistakes. What the public fails to see, of course, is that the destabilization of the Middle East is exactly what the bankers want. This war is to be sustained, so the region can be divided up. Domination of the oil chain, continual profit sweeps for defense contractors, and most obviously, permanent military bases established to be used as launching pads against other oil-bearing non-conforming countries, such as Iran and North Korea. For further implication that the civil war and the destabilization in the Middle East are purely intentional, in 2005, two elite British SAS officers were arrested by Iraqi police after being caught driving around in their car, shooting at civilians while dressed up as Arabs. After being arrested and taken to a jail in Al-Basra, the British Army immediately demanded the release of these men. When the Basra government refused, something unimaginable happened. Shattered walls and chaos. The British broke out the men by force, using tanks.
If you wish to destroy an area, how do you do it? Well, there are two ways. You can go in there and bomb it and so forth, but that is not very efficient. What you do is you try to get the people in that area to kill each other and to destroy their own territory, their own farms. And that's what's been done in that area. The way in which you destroy an opponent is get him to destroy himself by dividing his ranks against one another. Then you feed both sides. You have agents feeding both sides, inflaming both sides, and they kill each other off. And it's time that some of us woke up to this reality, to understand that people who try to maintain empires and create empires do it by manipulating the people they're trying to conquer.
You might want to ask yourself, why is the entire culture is utterly saturated with mass media entertainment from all sides, while the education system in America continues its stupefying downward slide since the US government decided to take over and subsidize the public school system?
What your government pays for, it gets. When we understand that, then we look at government-financed institutions of education and see the kind of students and the kind of education that's being turned out by these government-financed schools. logic will tell you that if what is being turned out in those schools was not in accord with what the state and the federal government wanted, then it would change it. The bottom line is that the government is getting what they have ordered.
George Orwell, in his famed and possibly prophetic work 1984, stated, "Power is not a means, it's an end. The object of prosecution is prosecution. The object of torture is torture. The object of power is power." The bottom line is, you are a slave to a debt you have no say in incurring. The bankers want to control everyone. It doesn't matter if you are important or not. It doesn't matter if you are rich or poor. It doesn't matter what God you believe in. It only matters if you are with or against them. Thank you everyone for watching today's video. Don't forget to hit that like button and share the video to your friends and family. This is Jeff, and this has been another episode of Mysteries Unraveled. See you in the next one.